Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the jewel of the NPS campus and the star of our program tonight, the Grand Ballroom. Before I start, I want to tell you, I actually want to talk about the entire building here, not just the ballroom. And the name for this building is Ament Hall. It's named after James Ament, the first president of the school, or the second president of the school. Oopsie. Boy, that goes fast. Sorry, folks. There we are, the exterior. So I'm going to start with the exterior, and then we'll go inside and then talk about the ballroom specifically. This, as I said, it was actually designed by Dr. Ament and built over the years 1926-27. Originally, though, on that site was another building, the Swiss Chalet. And the chalet was moved in 1923 to its current site just nearby to prepare the site for the ballroom building, or the Ament Hall. As you can see, it's 5 stories in height. The 2 lower levels are in stone, and the top 3 levels are in stucco, and it is at the lower stucco level that the ballroom starts. Let me show you there. So you can see this is where the ballroom floor is, where we're sitting right now. You can also see the recessed clerestory with the Gothic windows, and that is what is the clerestory over the heart of the ballroom floor. And then we have this very inappropriate brick addition here. This was a fire staircase that the Army added when they were the owners of the property came in 1942 for fire safety. And you notice here too we have a porte cochere with the stone balusters. Balcony. I'm going to show you something you probably won't ever see, but if you can see in this picture right up at the top, there is a balcony. This balcony is on the north side of the building, which would be to your right. It starts at the north end of the ballroom and wraps around the whole length. That balcony no longer exists. But you can see its ghost. If you look very closely, you can see the outlines of its brackets, the support brackets for it. We'll go inside. This building wasn't just the ballroom, obviously. It was used, had 2 major studios in it. One of them, the top picture on the left, was the fine arts studio where girls could learn sculpture, painting, drawing. And that fine arts studio was on the very top floor on the north side. It filled the whole length of the north side. And you notice up at the top, this is a skylight that opened up and brought in natural light, so they had very good light for that studio. The lower picture on the right is a room down in the very lowest level of the ballroom, again on the north side, and that was a arts and crafts room. You can see the girls working at tables there. But notice again, very large, tall windows, very high ceiling that brought in a lot of light. This one other use of the building during the seminary years was an apartment. The lower right picture shows the apartment connected to that balcony space over the porte cochere. So it was a very nice apartment. In later years, the 3rd owner of the school and president was Dr. Roy Tesco Davis, and this was also became his living quarters because Mrs. Ament still lived here. She lived in President's House, so Dr. Davis had this apartment for his family. Well, the way to get to the ballroom, you had to come up to the 3rd floor of this building. And this was the lobby area, or the main hallway that you all came through to get into this room. But you notice today that staircase is a lot more attractive than the one you came up. The ballroom at that time did not have doors into it. It was just open from the hallway, and obviously beautifully decorated. So let's talk about the ballroom. Here we are. A mix of styles. It has the Gothic revival in its Gothic stained glass windows, and this the hammer beam truss system, these large beams that are connected and held together by these large chains that connect those arches across the room. And that's really what's holding this building together, or at least the ballroom together. But then there are Romanesque revival features here too. The rounded arches, the rounded arches of the niches. But then we have finer things, the railings. We have our chandeliers, the small ones. It's kind of hard to see in this picture. The small ones are kind of a wedding cake style chandelier. The tall ones at the very top are a simple but elegant crystal chandelier. What's unusual a little bit about the ballroom is all the brickwork, all these pillars that are holding it up. That was kind of unusual to use an exposed brick in a rather fine-looking building. At the time, the style would have been probably to make it plaster. The first mention of the ballroom in the seminary documents is in June 1926. There was the graduating class was 100 students, and they had their individual names inscribed in the new ballroom according to a promise that Dr. Ament made to them as juniors. And if you notice in this picture, it's probably hard to see too, but along the brick pillars there are large brown plaques, really, that were on several, and I'm assuming that those were the plaques for the first senior class after the ballroom was built. They no longer exist, unfortunately, but I always wondered what these little ledges were along these brick columns. So if you walk around tonight, you will see there are these, and I'm assuming that those plaques were kind of based on those outcrops. We'll go on. Another part of the ballroom that is the ambulatory, which means a walkway. But I think the girls spent most of their time sitting in the ambulatory. As you can see, there are chairs around, and all the furniture in the ballroom was wicker, whether it was on the ambulatory or up in the balconies. It was all wicker furniture throughout, a rather wild pattern carpeting. And you see down at the lower right there, you can see very colorful piece of carpeting that was discovered during the renovation. Underneath old army carpeting and under an army layer of linoleum, we found this, we think, original seminary era or college era carpeting. It doesn't match the pattern that you see in the photo, but I'm sure that was not Army issue carpeting. So, another feature is the fireplace, which is directly across from your entry doors that you came in tonight. It's behind the screen here, but it is a very grand fireplace that was copied from a French chateau in the time of Francis I, but very elaborate, as you can see, carved female figures. And this is the fireplace today. It is still really quite intact and in good condition. Another feature of the ballroom was this wallpaper. This is a little bit close-up of the wallpaper. And this was supposedly, according to seminary documents, hand-blocked by an Italian. And the wooden blocks used in making the paper were buried in Belgium during World War I and not found until 10 years later, 10 years after the war, which would have been 1928. But the ballroom was finished in 27, and our evidence is that the wallpaper was here, so I'm not sure how that worked out. But the scenes depicted were taken from an estate in the Borromean Islands off the coast of Italy. So around the room, at least on the ambulatory level, were these very beautiful kind of island type of trees and so on. On the balcony levels, the wallpaper was different. And it's very hard to get an image of it, but it was a more simple pattern. It didn't look like it was a mural type of wallpaper like this one. Now let's go on to the chandeliers. The chandeliers are bronze and crystal. The large ones that hang in the center of the ballroom were not rewired during the renovation of the ballroom because of the extreme expense, so they cannot be lit. But the small ones that are around under the balcony, at all the balcony levels, are exact copy of the originals. They are copies because all of the originals were completely missing their crystals. And again, they would have had to be rewired, and it was easier to get new ones. But what happened here in these, as you can see in these pictures, is that in 2003, 2 of the chandeliers were stolen. And one of them, unfortunately, during the thieves taking it, dropped to the floor. And all this white stuff you see is crystals, all the broken crystals. And you can see the bronze framework here. This is what it looked like when we held it up, a little bent, and strands of crystals still existing. But I spent many hours putting all new crystals on, and there it is today, and it is hanging up there. So, well, thank you. A tedious job. And then back to the ambulatory. The source of music in the ballroom was by an electric auditorium Victrola orthophonic, which was supposedly the first to be installed in a school. And the large console for the orthophonic was known as Big Bertha. And this is Big Bertha. This is the large cabinet that was on the side of the on the ambulatory. You may not have seen in the full picture of the ballroom, there was a smaller cabinet that was in this very center of the ballroom, again, an electric console. But the question is, what happened to, and I should show what this thing is down here, if you can see that. That is the speaker for the Victrola, and it still has a tag, the Victor Victrola company on it, and it is right over your entry doors. And I might point out too, those are those brackets, beautiful, I forgot to mention, those beautiful classical revival brackets. These are in the original paint job. They still have touches of gold leaf on them. All the others here in the ballroom, underneath the balconies, have been painted white in the renovation. But I asked them to not touch these two so that we had an example of the original paint job. But the story is, what happened to Big Bertha? Well, at 5:30 a.m. on November 2nd, 1928, the girls on the 3rd floor of the ballroom here, up in their dormitory suites, smelled smoke. They found the upper part of the ballroom thick with smoke. At the same time, a watchman discovered that Big Bertha was on fire. The alarm sounded and everyone safely left the building, and the watchman and the kitchen staff men used fire extinguishers to put out fire, but Bertha was in complete ruins. They found out the fire was caused by a short circuit in the orthophonic. One thing I found of interest is the electrical contractor during the rehabilitation one day hooked up his radio to that speaker, and it works. So one of these days, we're going to hook up something so we can hear what that sounds like. Okay. One thing I did forget to mention, and I'm going to go back very quickly to this picture. A big part of this building during the 70 years was dormitory space on the lower floors and also definitely around the ballroom here, around the balconies. And these were the largest of the dormitories because they had an extra sitting room in addition to the bedroom. And you can see here's your sitting room, or your bedroom, and here's your sitting room up here. And they also then had a private bathroom. And these bathrooms were still intact with those original sinks when the Alexander Company came in 2006 and took over for the renovation of the property. Those sinks were still all in place here. So let me go back to where we were. And so what do you do with a ballroom? Oh, you dance, of course. And there was lots of dancing. Of course, this was a girls' school, so the girls had to dance with each other many times. The ballroom was initiated first in 1927 during the Mardi Gras celebration by the junior students. And then in June of that year, the alumni dance, because alumni would come back for commencement. This is a quote: "The alumni marched down the center of the floor and raised their oak boughs to form the arch under which the seniors advanced from senior house, all carrying their rose and lavender pennants. To those above in the balconies, it was a kaleidoscope of beauty as the promenade formed and reformed and wound and unwound its spiral of green and rose and lavender." And how beautiful that must have been from the balconies. But the ballroom got a lot of use of dancing because every day after lunch and dinner, the girls were permitted for 30 minutes to dance in the ballroom. So here you see the girls dancing with each other. But there were also dances for many occasions and holidays, and the music came either from the Victrola or they also brought in live bands, usually for the more formal dances. And here we have this is the Colonial Ball, a very frequent holiday custom for the seminary. You can see them all lined up, all the students. And of course the girls dressed as men. This, I guess, apparently was not one of the balls where they invited the boys. And then we have, a little bit later, this dates from 1940, this photograph where they did import the boys to dance. And you will see here in this picture, this drape is what is covering the speaker. So they probably had a live band for this dance. The picture on the left is interesting. The girls and their dates are lined up, and they're coming up here towards the fireplace where sits probably the dean of women, and maybe a couple other instructors or teachers. This was called the blessing. The girls had to bring their dates to be blessed by the dean before they could start the dance. Again, still very proper. So we now go to the next era and next use of the ballroom, which was the Walter Reed era when the Army came in 1942 and used the ballroom for a recreation hall for the patients. And here we see the patients up in the balconies. Here the ping pong tables were all over the floor here. And you notice here is a man that has lost his arm, still playing ping pong. There was a piano back here in the corner. So they use as a general recreation. I know they had small tables around. I'm sure they had board games and played things like that. They also used it here. This is one of the ballroom suites, dormitory suites where the patients are in the bed. These are the original beds from the seminary years. We have a nurse in the picture. Again, you see these beautiful brackets and then one of the crystal chandeliers. So these soldiers had pretty nice surroundings to recuperate in. The lower levels of this building, the two lower, were probably more patient rooms and treatment areas, and also the floor right below us was last used as offices for the Army Disability Agency. This photo is a picture of the Army Band in 1943. So one of the first bands, the Army bands to play here. I'm sure they played many times. But the man in this very tall man at the very last row is Louis Belson, who is a famous drummer who did play here in the band, but then he also later married Pearl Bailey. The Army added a permanent stage. These men are on a temporary stage, but later the Army did add a permanent stage at this end of the ballroom floor. And many USO shows came here to the then Walter Reed Forest Glen Annex to entertain the soldiers. And we know that Bob Hope was among one of the entertainers who came here. In later years, we know that Bill Cosby and Walter Matthau visited. Oh, I will mention Walter Matthau visited probably because his wife, Carol, was a student here. And her dormitory space was one of the ballroom dormitories. We then go on to the deterioration period. You know, the Army, they had moved, Walter Reed moved their patients out by the late 70s, early 80s, but the Army still rented out the ballroom for parties and events. In fact, in the mid to late 1990s, SOS held fundraising dances and events here in the ballroom. The building, because of its good, solid construction, was pretty stable, even though but it was showing a lot of wear. And maybe a little hard to see in this picture, but you can see how whoops, wrong thing. The 1970s drapes, this picture was taken in 2003. The 1970s drapes falling off the window. Here's the drape falling off here's the stage. There was old carpeting being ripped up in the wall. The plaster wall was falling down because of water leaks. There was there were a couple leaks in the roof, so there was water damage from that. But one of the worst ones was the next one, when SOS and the developer were walking through the ballroom. We just happened to see this one day, and water's pouring like crazy from a broken pipe up above. So we were able to stop that pretty quickly, thank goodness. But the good news is, in 2006, the Alexander Company came in and started the renovation of this property. And the ballroom ambulatory area served as the construction offices from 2006 to 2008. And then in 2009, they started the ballroom restoration, so the offices moved out and we started the restoration. And they did that by constructing scaffolding from the ballroom floor all the way up to almost the very top. You can see what they did. They created a plywood floor at the level of the statues, so that many times I walked up that scaffolding to inspect the statues and the crystals, because I happened to manage the restoration of the chandeliers and the sculptures at that level. But this is what they did. We dusted the statues. Several were repaired and reinstalled. There was a new sprinkler system put in. The ceiling was painted. The wood beams were renewed. The large chandeliers, like I said, were cleaned. At the main level, the Army stage was removed because it was not historic. And the floor here was refinished, so this is the original floor, just refinished. And the new chandeliers, replacement, the small ones, were being installed at the very last minute, literally, before the grand opening on September 2009. This is the ceremony for the grand opening that was held here in the ballroom. So through all that wonderful work, we have this gorgeous ballroom that we can all enjoy today. And now, thank you. I'm going to turn this over to Frank, and he's going to tell you all about the sculptures.
These are the two Georges. The one on the left is St. George, and the one on the right, of course, is the father of his country. And they're going to be up there for a minute. Let me do some preliminary remarks. I didn't study any modern Romance languages in school. And so here I am for the first time addressing a live audience in the ballroom, and every word being recorded. And I'm going to proceed to name works of art and artists and museums, many of which are in languages of which I do not speak a word. So you should be prepared to just laugh out loud. It's okay. I don't mind. I know I'm ignorant and I don't mind. In fact, if you want to, shout out the right pronunciation so that I'll learn something. So you're warned about that. Is it a niche? Is it a niche? Is it a niche? Is it a niche? I'm going to use just about every pronunciation because we're going to talk about them a lot. Where I come from, it's niche, and of course the French is actually niche. There are 42 of them. There's 3 at the end. They're in groups of 3. We have historical photographs of some of them, but surprisingly, probably fewer than half. So I can't say for certain, but I'm really quite confident that sometime in 1926 or 1927, when Dr. James Eli Ament, for the first time, opened the doors to Ament Hall and welcomed the girls here, I would be very surprised if there weren't, in fact, 42 plaster cast statues up there, one for each niche. So, what are they? That turned out to be quite interesting. I started out, whenever you do work in this area, whenever you look into the history of the school, or you, particularly in the seminary era, but even in the Army era, within the context of SOS's materials, what you find is that the earliest work, almost always, and it turns out usually the most helpful work, was done by Bonnie Rosenthal. So, cheers. And this is very true in this case. You've already seen the place filled with scaffolding, which is what it looked like for the first time I ever saw it back in 2009. And Bonnie was able to walk on the floor. She took the precaution, happily, of taking photographs of each of these statues, which turned out to be very useful because they're quite hard to get at. The numbers, very quickly, of the 42, we have 33 left. 2, you'll see pictures at the end, are in pieces that SOS still owns because they were broken by someone trying to steal them. But the trick was how to figure out what the ones were that aren't famous. That's a maker's mark, or sometimes called a hallmark. It turns out I now know that's an older one made out of brass or bronze. That's a newer one. The company changed their habits, and those are now aluminum. This one, I think, is on the father of his country up there. And now, so what does it say? Because you probably can't read it from there. Caproni Casts, P.P. Caproni and Bro, makers, Boston, USA. That key turned the lock. Pietro Paolo Caproni. When I first saw his name, I had a sneaking suspicion that we're talking to someone probably with Italian background. And it turned out to be true. Born in Barga, Italy, during the Civil War, and if we should think the Civil War in the United States was the country trying to fall apart, the Civil War in Italy that was going on at that time also was the country trying to come together. Victor Emmanuel working his way out into becoming the king of Italy, all of Italy, not just pieces of it. Pietro left and came to Boston before his 18th birthday, sometime in the 70s. By the time he was in his late 20s, he actually became relatively famous in that part of the world. He apparently was extremely talented at taking masterwork sculptures, making a mold of them, and then from the mold making plaster casts. He was very good at it. And they let him do that process with an astonishing number of sculptures, like Winged Victory of Samothrace. I don't know that I would let some 30-year-old get a hold of that and put it in a mold. He did. His brother, and his brother's Emilio, that's the and bro in the title, then bought a store, the existing store, that they owned from 1892, 2 years before the school opened, through 1927 when they sold it. That still exists, by the way. There were subsequent owners continuing to purchase it. It became finally, the name of it became Just Galleries, G-I-U-S-T. Just Galleries then was purchased in 1993 by a man who is himself a sculptor. He owns it to this day, and they still make sculptures, and they still have maybe 1,000 or so of the molds that Pietro made back in the 1890s and 1880s. And that's how it was done in those days. You couldn't, if you wanted to see Winged Victory of Samothrace and couldn't get to France, what do? There weren't color photographs, there weren't books, coffee table books, much less videos. So the way it was done was museums would have collections of these plaster casts of masterworks. Art studios and art schools especially had them to use as models. They don't get tired, they don't ever move. So students would learn to draw and learn to paint by making drawings and paintings of these sculptures. Van Gogh famously had a collection of them that he carried around with him when he was trying to teach himself to be a draftsman. And this is just a list of some of the Capronis were really good at it, and they sold a lot of these sculptures to a lot of institutions. They weren't the only ones in the world doing it, but they were some of the best. That's the outside of their shop in Boston. That's just one room. They had something like 5,000 square feet that was devoted just to showing off the stuff. I like that picture a lot. And so, whoops, let me back up. So, this is the day of the internet. Juiced Galleries has their catalog online. They also put the catalog of some of the historic catalogs that the Caproni brothers had issued online. There's a website called HathiTrust.org. Hathi was the elephant in some of the Mowgli stories. It's named for him. They have a lot of prior to copyright, before 1923 books that are available online. So you can look at the catalogs. Someone invented Amazon, so you can buy the catalogs. The big years were 1901, 1911, and 1922. So this is the 1901 catalog, and it's a little picture of the bust or sculpture and a number and how much it costs. If you've been to the earlier lectures or watched them on YouTube about the outdoor sculpture given by Fred and others, you know that the vast numbers of the zinc sculptures that were here were purchased from the J.L. Mott Ironworks in New York. For the plaster casts, the J.L. Mott company was the Caproni brothers. I'm quite confident that Dr. Ament, when it came time in 1926 to fill the ballroom, simply made a big purchase from the Caproni brothers, and all of these pieces came from that source. So now what I'm going to do is just survey the works. One more disclaimer that I should warn you. When you're there in the middle of the ballroom, those sculptures are actually fairly far away. And it's a very unusual perspective. You may be surprised, I was really surprised, because I'm not very good at this sort of thing, to learn that the tallest of all of the 33 that you're looking at now is exactly 4 feet high. All of them are 4 feet or less in height. So they're kind of far away and they're not very big, so you don't get a lot of detail. I am now going to show you, as you saw a sneak preview there, I'm going to show you photographs that one Bonnie Rosenthal took of each one of these pieces, and also pictures of them from the catalogs, and also occasionally, where I think it's helpful, pictures of them out in the world, the originals. What we're looking at is copies. We're looking at copies of sculptures that were produced originally in ancient Greece, which is not exactly right, of course. What it really is a copy of a Roman copy of a lost Greek original, almost always. At least one actual copy of a Roman original, famous. Copies of lots of Renaissance sculptures, and a few copies of more modern works. Well, tastes in these matters change a lot over time. Artistic sensibilities change. And I'm now in the process of embarrassing myself, but I don't want anyone to be surprised. The way to do it, it turns out, is very neat, because we have a perfect euphemism in English that we got 15 years ago from the very popular movie that came from the United Kingdom. And so to get myself out of my little discomfort, all I have to do is name the movie. The movie was The Full Monty. You've been warned. Okay. I'm going to do this sort of counterintuitively. I'm going to start in the east and work west, and I'm going to bounce back and forth from north to south. There is actually some ties between, and you'll see, you have to do it in some order. When Bonnie did the initial work, she calls these groups sections, and that's fine with me. So each group of 3 is a section. So that's section 1, she numbered them, they go all the way around to section 14. There's one small coincidence that's unfortunate. That means that General Washington here, if you have a military background or if you watched enough of the old MASH episodes, General Washington happens to be in section 8. That's a little awkward. Okay, it's a coincidence. She also numbered the sculptures, but when she took the pictures in 2009, 5 of them were out. One of these guys was used as part of the ceremony when the Army symbolically transferred ownership to Montgomery County, and he had not been returned. And 4 of them were being repaired. So she took pictures of them outside of the ballroom, and later, just a couple of weeks ago, took pictures of them in the ballroom. But the numbering doesn't work, so I renumbered them and started at 1 here and then all the way around to 33. Here's 2 vases. These 2, I think this is almost certainly an athletic event. The men are not wearing clothes, and there's one of them has a spear, but I think that's really probably a javelin. This does not call to mind, to me at least, any particular myth or story from ancient Greece. So I don't know what the meaning might be. The one nice thing is that these are turned so that you can actually see the whole, because we have 2 of them, the different faces are being shown. And so now this is the catalog, and this is where we'll get many of the names. So antique vase, original in the British Museum, 3 feet 3 inches tall, and the price. Okay? I'm not a big fan of the vases, so forgive me. So here now meet the sculptor. This is Cyrus Dallin, very interesting man. Born in Utah, his family was members of the LDS church, but in his adulthood he actually converted and became a Unitarian. He was, when he lived in Utah as a young man, or as a young boy, he moved about the same time. You can see he was almost exactly contemporary with Mr. Caproni. He also, before the age of 18, moved to Boston. But while he was still in Utah, he had several encounters with native peoples who lived in the area, and they impressed him very much. He is now famous for hundreds of sculptures of Native Americans, a couple of which are really quite remarkable. He also, even though he had become a Unitarian, the LDS Church approached him when it was time to put the spire on the tabernacle. And so he actually did, in fact, do that sculpture. And it inspired all the others, so including the one that's not far from here, the Angel Moroni. So there's number 32. That was one of the ones that was being prepared. So that's called the peace pipe. I have to admit it doesn't do much for me. It's not that interesting to me. 3 foot tall. So that's the entry. Dallin did not have a licensing agreement with Caproni Brothers until after 1915, so they had a special catalog of his work. None of his stuff is in the 1911 version. It's all in the 1922 version. And there's number 2 now. We're coming on this side. Another Indian figure, but rather different. And you can probably tell who that is. In my youth, Sacagawea, now we're told Sacagawea. As you know, interpreter and guide for Lewis and Clark. And the little guy on her back, Jean-Baptiste. I didn't realize until I started looking into it, for 100 years, Sacagawea was not that much talked about or known about. We still don't really know much about her. She's not mentioned that much in Lewis Clark's journals. But what put her on the map, and now, of course, you can't talk about the history of America, and particularly Western expansion, without getting her name in there. The thing that changed it was the suffragettes, and I didn't know that. The suffragettes adopted her as their sort of example of how ridiculous it was that men would not extend to women the right to vote. They commissioned a number of sculptures and had copies made, and they put statues of Sacagawea everywhere. So that's what started her rising to what is now that overworked word, iconic status. She really is an icon. And there she is in the catalog with the front and back view, so you can see the papoose. And there she is in her niche. Another wonderful name, Laredo Zadok Taft, young man from Illinois, spent his whole career in Chicago. He studied, I think I brought, it's in there, right? He studied with, did I mention it? No. He studied with Henri Chaput, which is cool because Chaput is the man who did the Joan of Arc that's out here in bronze that we have. And this is one of his sculptures up there. And that's a picture by one Bonnie Rosenthal of the original, which you've seen if you've ever been to Union Station. The big fountain of Columbus, that's that sculpture. Now section 13. This is wonderful. This is Minerva. The bust is not made from the full figure statue, but it's modeled on it. And there she is, Minerva of Velletri, right? Velletri is the place where this was found. It's a Roman copy of a Greek original. And I love that. The helmet looked like wearing a baseball cap up. You know, you normally would put the helmet down so that it protects your face, but she's wearing the helmet up. Now we're over on this side again, section 4, vases. This vase is really wonderful. There's a wonderful griffin there, and it says, and inscription. That's the inscription. Cannot make a sense of a word of it. My Latin is not nearly good enough. It turns out it's very difficult, and the president of SOS, Ann Brockett, just sent me the other day. She found an article where someone was describing how difficult it is to translate these inscriptions, and he translated that one. So this is a funerary urn of a man who lived to be 33, and served for 13 years in the Constantine's cavalry guard. This is another copy of a Greek original, so it's Ceres, the goddess of the harvest. She's there. And I have to say, this one doesn't do much for me either in the Vatican. So I often wondered what's in her hand. It's probably wheat or something. Thomas Brock, sculptor. He did this one. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow is not Karl Marx. The famous poet, really, we're not going to spend a lot of time on any of these guys, but America's first real celebrity who wasn't either in the military or a politician. And he wrote the poems that, in my day, people read. Not long after the sculpture was done, his reputation began to decline and has been declining ever since. No one reads him anymore. I happen to love his translation of the Divine Comedy. I think it's really quite strange that's what he was working on at the end of his life, towards the end. What's unusual here is, and it really still surprises me, Longfellow, a fan of Longfellow's, the sculptor, made this sculpture 2 years after his death, and he's in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, and he's the only American in Poets' Corner. I was really surprised to learn that. So now we're at the one that we started with, that's St. George. This is Donatello, maybe the most important piece we have. Donatello is essentially one of the inventors of the Renaissance. And this is his St. George. There's a church in, it's now in the Bargello, but that's a copy. That's where the original is. There's a copy that's still outside on the church, and I'll show you that. Donatello was famous for his bas-reliefs. That's a little one. It's St. George slaying the dragon. I'm told by people who know about these things, I don't, that it is the first bas-relief done using point perspective, which is the big moment, one of the big moments that gets the Renaissance going. Say again? The first bas-relief using point perspective. Yeah, so as opposed to just flat. So this is a very important piece in art history, done at the same time that Henry V was hanging out at Agincourt, 1415. They were born in the same year. Next to him is Franz Liszt, Hungarian composer, who wanted to be a pianist virtuoso the same way that Paganini was a violin virtuoso. Liszt sort of invented being a piano virtuoso, and was the father of Cosima, who married Wagner, so he was Richard Wagner's father-in-law. Vases, identical vases with ram's heads in the Vatican. Very nice. And Horace Mann, the only educator in the group. And that'll do, a father of the common school movement. We have public education in America, and everybody goes to an elementary school and a high school that's paid for by the citizens of their town, because Horace Mann thought that would be a good idea. So now we switch over here, section 11. We'll get back to that. The one on the right has the big crest on the helmet. The one that's here does not. But it's identified here as Ajax, and the original is in Florence. This is actually a copy of a marble copy that was inspired by the larger statue. And that's the larger statue. And I bring that in. That's very common that busts are modeled off of larger statues. This is just an astonishing statue. I love this piece. This is at the end of book 17 of the Iliad, and it's not Ajax, that's actually Menelaus, the husband of Helen, who started the whole thing. And that's the body of Patroclus, Achilles' friend and kinsman. Next to him is the Singing Boys from Florence. And next to them, there's another case of bust made from statue. That's Juno Farnese. Mr. Farnese, he was a cardinal. He was the grandson of the Pope. In those days, popes sometimes had children before they became Pope. He had the largest collection of ancient statue of antiquities, probably in the world at the time. And so he's famous for his Hercules, actually, Heracles. But the Juno is very nice also, which is actually it's actually Hera, but they use the Roman names. Meditation. This is a gentleman, I think I showed that. He was around in the 1900s, right? He did a lot of decorative work. This thing is everywhere. It's a lawn ornament. There's Felix Mendelssohn, composer. Switch to the other side. This is from a fountain. It's a very nice piece, actually, called a cherub. Actually, a puto. Cherub with dolphin. My friend Beethoven, my favorite composer. The Beethoven and the Mendelssohn were no longer for sale in 1922. This is the most interesting, I think, of all of the pieces. This is called Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory by Cyrus Dallin, the guy who did the Indian statues. You see the putis on their legs, their bandages wrapped around their legs, and then the doughboy uniform. This is Zeus. That's Minerva again. Justiniani was the name of the guy who owned a big collection again, like I said previously, and that's of course Athena. Augustus Caesar. This is one of the most famous statues in the world. It's in the Vatican. The Augusta Suprema Porte is what it's known now, found in 1863. Wonderful detail. That's the Roman original. I said we would have at least one copy of a Roman original now in the Vatican museums. And that brings us around to, he's the only one who hasn't moved that I know of. He and George have not moved. That brings us finally to our end at section 8. Wonderful vases. Guess what's on them? Seahorses. Absolutely. You won't be able to tell, and it was Ann Brockett, our president, who pointed it out to me. I don't know if you can, you can't tell in this photograph. They actually had to shave off the end of the rim there on the back to get that up on the niche. So this is actually cut back there. Somebody took a big saw and cut part of the vase off so that it would fit. The Neptune vase, that's Neptune with the seahorses next to him. Normally he's in the chariot being pulled by seahorses, and this time he's just hanging out with them. And then that brings us to number 17 at the West End. George Washington by Laredo Taft, who did Christopher Columbus. That's the 4-foot tall one. That's the tallest statue, but it's really tall. It's at the University of Chicago. And Victory and Mercury, no longer here. You know that one, that's the FTD Florist logo? And this is the only one by a German sculptor, a man named Rauch, which is German for smoke. He did 4 or 5 of these, wildly popular in his day. Ta-da!